And people are beginning to understand now, I think, that knowing things intellectually is important, but our personal, psychological, and emotional, even spiritual maturity are equally important.
Welcome to the Set and Setting podcast with Madison Margolin. As a journalist, Madison has spent years exploring the intersection of psychedelics, cannabis, and culture. This podcast brings together thought leaders from today's psychedelic renaissance to talk about the role of psychedelics in our inner and outer lives. You can support this podcast and find additional resources at BeHereNowNetwork.com/Madison.
Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Set and Setting podcast. I'm really excited that our guest today is Marianne Williamson. Marianne Williamson is a political activist, author, non-denominational spiritual lecturer, and New York Times bestselling author. Her career began in the 1980s, during which time she became deeply involved with the HIV and AIDS activism. A longtime champion for the LGBTQ plus community, she founded Project Angel Food to deliver meals to the homebound unable to shop or cook for themselves. To date, the charitable organization has served over 16 million meals. She also founded the LA Center for the Living, the Manhattan Center for Living, and co-founded the Peace Alliance. She's been a nonprofit activist throughout her career. She has produced numerous progressive candidate summits and podcasts to encourage more women, LGBTQ+, radically diverse, and progressive Democrats to run for office. Over the years, she's lectured to hundreds of thousands of people on spiritually and politically progressive topics, sold over 3 million books, and has done extensive work with the ill and dying. Marianne has also written 15 books, 7 New York Times bestsellers, and 4 of them hitting number 1. In 2020, she ran for the Democratic nomination for President of the United States and is now a candidate challenging the candidacies of President Biden and Robert F. Kennedy Jr. As an essential part of her platform, Williamson proposes a 21st century economic bill of rights, the Department of Peace, reparations for slavery, Department for Children and Youth, and a just transition from a dirty to a clean economy. A progressive Democrat, Williamson proposes a new economic beginning, including universal health care, tuition-free college and tech school, and a guaranteed living wage. She was born and raised in Houston, Texas, in 1952. She has one daughter, India Moore Nisbet, I hope I pronounced that right, who's married and lives in London with her newborn daughter, Elizabeth. Wow, thank you so much for coming on the show. It's such an honor to have you.
Well, thank you very much for being here. I feel a connection to your family, so thank you.
Yeah, so for those in the audience who don't know, who aren't familiar, my stepmother was, I guess, worked with you kind of a while back.
We've worked together and we're friends, and yeah.
Mm. Yeah, and my stepmom, I guess she's really a part of the foundation for a lot of the questions that I am going to ask today, because she's someone who's very much on her own spiritual journey, highly influenced by Ram Dass Maharaji, and is also one of the most politically active people I know, and very involved with the Occupy movement, and is always kind of interrogating where politics are at, and really digging beneath the surface of why things are the way they are. And so I really see her as kind of bridging the gap between the spiritual and the political, and activism, and what's motivating us from the inside out. And so, Marianne, I also see you a lot that way, maybe because I associate you with my stepmom. So, why don't we just start with, how did you kind of get onto this path? You've done so much politically, you've done so much writing, you've done so much activism, nonprofits, et cetera. So what drives you? Where is this all coming from?
I think life is kind of like building a lasagna. You have to do the cheese separately from the sauce, separately from the pasta. And then at a certain point, you put it all together. And it's interesting because I feel like at this point in my life, all the various things that I've done and been involved in sort of come together. And I think it's sad that more people don't see politics that way. Politics should be a full-throated, whole person involvement in our lives. It's really the purview of our collective behavior. When you try to heal your own life, transform your own life, live a better life. You ask deep questions. What am I doing? What are my principles? Am I being a good person? Am I being ethical? Am I taking care of my home? Politics should be the same level and kind of questioning. Are we being a good country? Are we being an ethical economy? Are we taking care of the home, which is our earth? We won't make it if in the 21st century, we don't have that shift in consciousness from a sole focus on me to a more expanded focus on we. Now, it's one thing to say that, but to actually mean it and to apply that to business, to economics, to foreign affairs, to environmental activism, to issues of justice, the love that will save the world can't just be the love for our own children. The love that will save the world has to be the love for everybody's children at this point. And the biggest dangers to us, look at something like the wildfires in Hawaii. If you were in Lahaina, it didn't matter if you were rich or you were poor. That fire was coming for your house. So I think that people are in process right now. I think that the issue of internal as well as external change, we're moving past the either or. Even 10 years ago, we were still pretty much stuck in, the people who were interested in politics, where it was a transactional model, just treat the symptoms. But then people started thinking, I think the problem goes a little deeper. And people who 10 years ago were thinking, all I can do is heal myself. My only responsibility is this narrow universe of me, 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 and somehow that will magically help transform the whole, are also have been realizing, I think I have a little more responsibility than that. And now I think there's a coming together, there's a melding. I feel that in my own conversation with people, because when this merger of sorts was happening in my heart and mind, I was losing everybody. There was no place for me to go. The spiritual types were like, what happened to you? Why are you talking about politics? And people who were my political alliances and people who saw politics the same way as I said, oh, she just wouldn't talk about that spiritual stuff. Now, particularly with the younger generation who had been raised by mothers like yours, it's a comfort zone to move easily, gliding back and forth between my depression and drone warfare. Younger people, I find, have a listening, which is similar and harkens back to what was true when I was young. Because like when I was in college, we would read Ram Dass and Alan Watts in the morning. And then we would go to Vietnam anti-war protests in the afternoon. There wasn't the sense of silos that there are today. Everybody's in their freaking silo. And that's not working. Whether it's your politics, whether it's your race, whether it's your sex, your sexuality, your gender, your religion, your culture, at a certain point, we have to move, not to minimize those individual identities because they have significance and must be looked at. But in alchemy, there's this concept, separatio. You separate out all the elements to perfect them, but then it's so that they can all come together at a higher level. So that's what happened in my own life of things coming together. Martin Luther King said we need quantitative changes in our circumstances, but also qualitative changes in our souls. We need quantitative and qualitative change. And I think that speaks to a 21st century perspective, which is very needed. And I'm glad to see embraced.
So I have so many questions based on what you just said, but one of the questions that I have that I've been chewing on for several years now is how do you bridge sort of the relationship between individual and then collective healing? And, I guess to kind of give you some context to that, I wrote a story probably 5 years about right now for Playboy about the role of trauma in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and how people need to...
In the what conflict? I'm sorry.
Israeli-Palestinian.
Okay.
So, and how dealing with individual level trauma will ultimately change the whole political paradigm. And the way people are voting and who they're voting for and how they're being manipulated by politicians and this and that and whatever. And it's obviously not that the role of trauma and the role of the necessity for healing is not specific only to Israel-Palestine, but obviously here in America too. So how do we bridge that gap? And, seeing as the culture is sometimes, I think personally, overly individualistic, like it's all about me and my process and my healing journey and whatever. How do we get from there to seeing our role in the systems that are making us sick?
Well, it's a process of personal maturity. I didn't read your article. I'd like to. I'd love to. I wrote an article in Newsweek magazine a couple of years ago on the tragedy of unprocessed trauma. It was exactly how I spoke of Israel and Palestine. The psychic center of Israel is reaction to having been traumatized by the Nazis. The psychic center of the Palestinians is having been the trauma of having been traumatized by the Israelis. If I have not processed my own personal trauma, it's very difficult for me to be present to your suffering. And so the real pioneers in that area of the world, and this speaks to everything we're talking about what is needed in leadership now, are not just the old dynamic of diplomacy as we think of it on a transactional level. Some of the best minds within the context of traditional diplomatic efforts and negotiation have tried and failed when it comes to Israel and Palestine. So now, and I'm assuming you've been there, you've met people, otherwise you wouldn't have been able to read that article. I would think you'd agree with me that the people who are really the leaders opening up a field of possibility are as emotionally intelligent as they are politically astute. The old politics is not going to get the job done. I think that, I don't know, when you went to Israel, did you ever go to the hand-in-hand schools?
Actually, I think I did once. I probably
No.
Oh, yeah.
Really profound, because there's so much of an understanding of synapses in the brain that can be forged in early childhood that go beyond opposition. I won't spend time on that because your original question was, how do we get there? And we get there through a process of personal maturity. And people are beginning to understand now, I think, that knowing things intellectually is important, but our personal, psychological, and emotional, even spiritual maturity are equally important. Dr. James Doty, who was a neurosurgeon at Stanford, has said that neuroscientists are now realizing there's more of a highway, more of a partnership in the intelligence of the body between the brain and the heart than they used to realize. So the answer to your question for me on a practical level is there are a lot of hours in the day. And we are responsible for the lifestyle decisions that either make or break our capacity to do what we feel in our hearts we are meant to do, an effort that is impossible outside the preparation of our nervous system. So you wake up in the morning, you take a shower, you take a bath, you brush your teeth. You don't want to take into the day yesterday's dirt on your body. But if you wake up in the morning and you don't meditate, or you don't pray, you don't, whatever your practice, your nervous system, modernity is an assault on our nervous system. We're living in times of chaos. We're living in times of spiritual darkness. If you just wake up in the morning and let your mind be eaten alive by the news, by social media, by the chaos and the turbulence of the modern world, don't be surprised if you are then depressed by noon. Because if you're only filtering evidence and determining evidence of what's really going on based on what the physical eyes can see and the physical ears can hear, then it's such a fractured view of what is happening underneath. And you become at the effect of all that. So in the morning, when you say, how do you do it? There is no serious spiritual or religious practice I've ever read about that does not emphasize the power of the morning. So otherwise, you're carrying the stress of yesterday into the world. You're not only carrying your own stress, you're carrying the stress of everybody in Maui, you're carrying the stress of everybody in Ukraine and Somalia. So through preparation. And in the Course in Miracles, there's a question, where would you have me go? What would you have me do? What would you have me say into whom? Then you might not be an enlightened master all day, but the chances of your falling off the spiritual wagon are drastically decreased. And your chances of centeredness, non-reactivity, compassion, effectiveness are greatly increased. Everything we do is infused with the consciousness with which we do it. That's why Gandhi said the end is inherent in the means. And that's why you can have the best idea and the best plans, but if you go sabotaging yourself because of your own unprocessed stuff, and I think a lot of people realize all that now.
So, really what I wanted to get to in this conversation is exactly that, is like, how do our spiritual practices inform our political beings? And so one thing that you touched on is nervous system regulation. And I think just being able to process all the information that's happening in the world around us with the political situation, with climate change, with, natural disasters, whatever, are we processing that from a place of being regulated and sturdy in ourselves? And then making decisions and, voting for people or whatever who are going to quote unquote solve those issues, or at least attempt to do something about them. How do our spiritual practices enable us to go to think differently, to feel differently, and then to take different type of action?
The phrase you used was processing the information. If we actually dismantle that, I think a lot of it is, like the physical eye, okay? Right now, you and I, just looking at each other and looking at the computer, are picking up, somewhere I read, like millions of pieces of data. But the brain is deciding what's important, like that we look at each other or whatever. So a lot of the processing of data and information that is necessary to live any kind of an enlightened perspective about politics or anything else today involves letting go the junk, which the higher mind can do. So there's some seriously important data, but the factors that in a healthy society actually help you gain perspective, because everything is profit-based now, we can't depend on those things anymore. Even when I was a kid, I could depend on the news to give me some perspective on what was most important. Today, I can't, not mainstream media. So today, through spiritual practice, your brain begins to work differently. You come from a place of quiet, a place of inner quiet. And because the world now, if you just base your perception on what's going on, it's like this. Everybody's traumatized. Nobody has any impulse control. Everybody, like I said, modernity is an assault. You meditate, you're not looking to change things to make them peaceful. You gain your peace. And then you go out into the world to be the peace. And your brain starts to disregard junk. The brain is amazing. You become less interested. Certain things that would distract you and eat you alive. Right now, nobody can take on everything. It's so big, the destruction and creation that is happening right now. None of us can take on everything. All of us are assigned to the piece we can best play. And the brain, it has an amazing ability. Just drop it. It's unimportant. And you start not noticing it. Because part of the problem is not only that we are distracted by the ultimately meaningless things and unimportant things because of technology and algorithms and addictions and all that, but also we're missing like signs and signals and coincidences and synchronicities that really are on the path and will tell you the next thing to do. So that's why I always say in my lectures, I've been saying for years, this is the formula, everybody. Pray in the morning, kick ass in the afternoon. You have to prepare your nervous system, and you're not going to get it completely right all the time. But I'll tell you something else. The universe of ultimate reality, works like a GPS. So you make a wrong turn, the machine recalibrates. So when you're living in that space, even when you got it wrong, you're more quick to go, ooh, I shouldn't have said that. You're more quickly to know, well, do I apologize? Do I tone? Is it best not to say anything? But also, you are more geared towards blasting a conversation with love before you even walk into the room. Reminding yourself throughout the day what is really going on here and what you're really here to serve. So it's a practice. It's just like, it's a yoga of the mind. No different than yoga. You do weight training and yoga to train your physical body so you can move. You do meditation, prayer, reflection, mindfulness, whatever your practice is, to create the musculature of stillness. The inner muscles are not about your capacity to move. Those are the outer muscles. The inner muscles, the attitudinal musculature, is to remain calm, still, and non-reactive. I had a meeting yesterday that meant a lot to me. But I knew if I went in there with an emotion-backed attitude, a needy attitude, a demanding attitude, if I didn't clear myself first, then I would be in a space that actually contributed to the problem. So I had to do my inner work first, clear myself, find respect for everybody involved, clear my own lesser, it's not about you, Marianne, get over it. And you find that still space, and a bit of a miracle happened today. A transformation that I would have wanted, but which would not and could not have happened if I had entered needy, controlling, demanding, mad, or in any way out of that place within us that we all want to be in. Does that make sense? Because that's the place out of which miracles occur naturally. Breakthroughs, the universe is already, it's already designed to self-correct. But if we're not in that space of be still and know, find your center, clear your stuff, then you're not a conduit for that happening.
So, I think some people listening to this, and even myself, the question is how, right? You said you cleared yourself, or when you wake up in the morning, like pray first, meditate, whatever, then kick ass. So often I think we show up to the practice and we're there and we're looking like, has it been 5 minutes yet? How do you actually do it? So what does it look like to clear yourself?
Well, the word disciple and the word discipline are the same. It's no different than resistance to physical exercise. But notice with physical exercise, if you haven't been doing it, you don't want to do it. Once you start doing it, your body says, when am I going to exercise today? there is a discipline involved, but today nobody has an excuse. There are so many forms. It could be transcendental meditation, it could be the Course in Miracles, it could be the Kabbalah, it could be esoteric Christianity, it could be Buddhism. I mean, there are so many paths. So there are 3 categories of people listening to what you just said. One category listening to this is going, they're right, and I do it every day, and they're right, and those are my results. The second category is saying, they're right, I really should be doing that. I know. I know the path that's right for me, but I don't. I wake up in the morning and I go right to Twitter and I'm off and running. Then there's a third category. And the third category is, this sounds like it might be true. I just don't know what to do. And to those people, I say, if that's what's really in your heart, if that's your willingness, then remain alert, because books are going to fall at your feet within 2 or 3 days. You're going to notice on the computer something about a meditation class. Some friend is going to ask, why don't we go over to hear a lecture by? If you really want that, and that's your heart's desire, prayer, whatever, be alert, because the universe is going to go right to you. Some book, something. Just be open. Be open.
What is
live
prayer?
in awe? We don't live in enough of a state of awe.
What does it look like for you personally? And I think, just to kind of preface the conversation, I don't think anyone has to be a full-on believer in God necessarily. Maybe
No, there are secular paths as well as spiritual religious paths. For me personally, I'm a student of A Course in Miracles. So the Course in Miracles workbook is very much my practice. Plus, I do transcendental meditation. Also, I have a friend, the author Catherine Woodward Thomas. I don't know if you've looked at her books. This morning and yesterday, nobody can priest themselves. So a lot of the stuff I would say to other people, I can't treat my blind spots. We're all on the path. And Catherine, I have to tell you, I'm very fortunate to have that sacred sister, She's also a therapist, I think, yeah. And Spirit will send you what you need. But for me, that doing that workbook in the morning, the Course is not a religion. There's no doctrine or dogma, but there's 365 days worth of meditation exercises. And when you meditate, your brain literally emits different brainwaves. The Dalai Lama says, in order to save the world, we must have a plan, but no plan will work unless we meditate. And that's how I see in my own life that marriage of political activism and spiritual practice. That I have to know what I'm doing. I have to educate myself. I have to, and believe me, when it comes to a presidential campaign, there's plenty of outside work to be done. But if I don't center myself and give attention to as much to who I am as to what I'm doing, you crash and burn.
So shifting gears into the politics themselves. So I, most of the audience knows by now, and I think I told you as well, the thrust of my journalism has been on psychedelics for so long. And, people joke or say, well, if everyone just did psychedelics, like all the political problems would be solved. I don't know if I believe in that. I think psychedelics really just make you more you, right? And it depends like how much you're processing and integrating. There was an article that came out a couple of years ago that was called Lucy in the Sky with Nazis, and about how
I'm sorry, what was it called?
Lucy in the Sky with Nazis. I think it was on a psychedelic site called Symposia. I think that's which site. But basically how people from the alt-right or whatever, everyone's taking psychedelics, and it doesn't necessarily mean it's shifting their political views, although it can, and it often does. And so, really what the way I've come to understand it is that rather than psychedelics themselves, really psychedelic consciousness. And so I think that also includes meditation consciousness, prayer consciousness, some sort of connection to divine source outside ourselves. That is ultimately what's going to shift things. And because, and according to the science and also anecdotal evidence, is that they have the power to kind of make us feel more empathy and connection to not just to not just kind of within ourselves and getting aligned with soul and spirit and heart and mind, but also like seeing someone else outside ourselves as part of this collective being. So, and from there, then we can make political decisions that are slightly more empathetic, or that we start to see nature in a different way and actually, want to see policies that protect it and so forth. So my question for you is like, how does that kind of consciousness relate to some of the most pressing political issues that you see, whether it's environmental or healthcare or whatever it is?
Once you've had that experience, you can't conceive of destroying the Amazon. Once you've had that experience, you can't conceive of poisoning the rivers. Once you've had that experience, you can't conceive of allowing a child to go hungry. Once you've had that experience, you can't conceive of spending more money on ways to kill each other than ways to heal each other. Now, as you yourself said, the point isn't to have that experience and just keep having that experience because it's fun to have that experience. The issue is to have that experience, take the imprint, allow it to change you, and then go out and do the work on this earth because you're here for this short time to get it done.
So how do we know that once you've had this experience and integrated it into your psyche and mentality that you're still going in? And again, the way that I see the solution is not still always necessarily going to be the same way someone else sees that solution. So how do we sort of bridge the political divide in America or in general where we all say we all have the same goal, and yet the path there is so riddled with strife and controversy and, seeing as the country just feels more and more polarized.
Every situation we're in is a lesson. It's the rehearsal of a lesson, rehearsal. And life has a way of teaching you. And sometimes the lesson is, yeah, you know all that, and you took that drug, and you had cosmic consciousness. But when you just talk to that person, you were a real jerk. And you don't get a pass because you had a moment of consciousness. I was at the Iowa State Fair over the last few days. And I talked to this really nice man. And he was there with this clipboard working for Trump. And then there was this woman sitting next to me on the plane going home. And she was the nicest lady. And she's just been at the fair too. And she was all excited. She got to meet Nikki Haley and have lunch with Mike Pence and Senator Grassley. She was a real nice lady. And life has shown me, Martin Luther King said, you have very little morally persuasive power with people who can feel your underlying contempt. We can talk cosmic consciousness all we want, but it really gets down in any moment. Were you nice or were you a jerk? And, it's that Rumi, out beyond all ideas of good or bad, right or wrong, there is a field, I'll meet you there. The first thing we have to do, there's a line in the Course where it says the primary responsibility of the miracle worker is to accept the atonement for yourself, to go into any situation and clear your own self-righteousness, your own I know more, your own my politics are better. The left has as much purification of heart to work on as the right does. Sometimes on a personal level, it almost feels to me more. I said to this Republican the other day on a podcast, I said, we have the egalitarian policies, but the left has a more elitist attitude towards its own constituency. You guys have a more egalitarian relationship to your own constituencies, but your policies are so elitist. He laughed. So we spend so much time pointing the finger at other people. They need to hit cosmic consciousness or whatever. How am I doing? And, enlightenment begins as an abstract concept. And sometimes, all those processes can be part of it. But we're in the human experience. Now, the point is for it to trickle down. And nobody gets a pass. Nobody gets a pass. Nobody, I don't care how much you know abstractly, I can tell you. It's Mother Teresa walks into the sunlight or Hitler went into the sunlight. The processes of nature are going to be the same. So listen, this is the process of personal evolution. I don't think the question, because you've asked several times, how? I think how makes it's are you available to the process? Because you will bleed. It's painful. Because we all carry within ourselves the imprint of a world that is dying. One world is dying, another world is being born. And we're called to be death doulas and birth doulas. And one of the part of the thing about the world that's dying is that we have to keep some pillars of it. Not only that, we need it to die gently. Or this could be a violent eruption on the planet that could be horrifying. So we have to be, the angel of death is very tender too. To really be kind to the world that is passing away and to be compassionate towards the fear that some people feel who do not have a larger picture of what's possible. We're also called upon to be the birth doulas of the new so that we can articulate a vision of what's possible so that people aren't just stuck in, no, it's terrible. This apocalyptic decline that too many people are spiraling into of anger and fear and depression and anxiety and nihilism. We have to tend to those emotional realities.
You said I asked a bunch of how questions, but I had another one for you.
Okay.
Which is, just for someone who really in earnest is doing their own inner work and wants to, and really wants to kind of be more politically involved or more aware, find ways that they can actually go outside themselves. Like where do you suggest they start? And again, it's maybe the answers come, right? Like when you're tuning in, maybe
I've written a couple of books that I would recommend to people who, I'm a popularizer. That's what I do. So I wrote a book called The Return to Love that was sort of popularizing Course in Miracles. I always say write a cliff note. I wrote the cliff notes, And I wrote 2 books about politics, one called Healing the Soul of America and one called The Politics of Love. And they are kind of spiritual, political perspective made easy. Now, other people have written great books. I'm not saying mine are the best, but that which I have to offer to that conversation in those books, where I go back to, I talk about Gandhi, I talk about King, I talk about the founders, I talk about neoliberalism, what happened in the last 50 years, I talk about corporatocracy, I talk about racism, but I talk about them all within the context of the larger story of America, which for me is really helpful. Because if you only throw data at me and you only throw facts, and I don't know what the historical arc was, then I feel disempowered. I'm supposed to just memorize facts and try to figure out meaning. But for me, if I can see, oh, this was what was going on when this country was founded. Oh, this was what was going on with the Transcendentalists. Oh, this is what was going on with Gandhi. Oh, this was going on with King. Oh, this was going on with neoliberalism. Then I'm like, okay, I get it now. It's just like when you go to therapy and you look into your parents and your grandparents and you look into your people and know, then you know where you sit within the line. You know what went on in the past, what was good that I want to imbibe and even pass on in a better way? And what was there that I go, no, I'm cutting the cord, but that's not going to my kids. Both. That's what the individuation process is for an individual. And that's also the individuation process for a conscious generation, particularly given, I assume you're a millennial. Gen Z weren't even born in the 20th century. So we're having this painful birth process. Millennials, why should millennials and Gen Z, why should any of us really, but particularly millennials and Gen Z, why should you live your lives at the effect of bad economic ideas left over from the 20th century? But the more you understand about where those ideas came from, the more you get what the game is that's been played, the more powerful you are. You say, oh, I get it. And that's what my campaign is based on. And that's, I think, the success of my campaign is that when I tell the story of the founding of this country and the struggle that even existed then between the angels of our better nature and the demons of our lower nature, which is also, then people get, oh, this is no different than slavery versus abolition. This is no different than institutional suppression of women versus the women's movement. This is no different than the Gilded Age versus the labor movement. This is no different than segregation versus the civil rights movement. It's simply our turn. But once you know the story and oh, I get it. This is just the latest iteration. There's just no comparison between who you are once you know that compared to who you are when you just find it all so confusing and it's traumatizing and I don't know what to do. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think some people might argue, and again, this is coming from the circles that I've been party to in the psychedelic space and whatever, that if you've really internalized this kind of psychedelic consciousness and the empathetic cosmic sort of paradigm, how could you support capitalism, for instance? Or, how could you have certain types of political views? So my question is, what you mentioned the economic model. What is an economic paradigm that actually reflects more spiritualized?
To me, it's a hybrid economy, much like you see in Scandinavian countries, where there is a free market, which there's not now. When you have big corporations dominating and monopolizing, that's not even a free market. And the primary architect of free market capitalism, Adam Smith, said it cannot exist outside an ethical context. So I agree with what you have said to the extent that you cannot have seen and support vulture capitalism, because it is inherently unfair. Now, some people say, if you've seen, how could you support capitalism? I don't go that far, because I think there is such a thing as righteous profit and win-win business models. And to me, what you have in countries like Scandinavia is an example of that. But I do think that almost gets into a little bit of semantics. I'm not sure it matters. What does matter is that I agree with you. You can't have seen certain spiritual truths and be okay with the way America's economy works today. You can't, because it's unfair, because it is unjust, because in policy after policy, decisions are made that make it easier for those who already have capital to get more and harder for those who do not have capital. And that's an ever increasing number who are simply struggling to get by. Now, whether you see it as anti-capitalism or you see it as I do, which is that modern capitalism has lost its moral center, it is a malevolent strain, and that we have to put those guardrails back up because the purpose of the government is to broker individual liberty, including economic liberty, with a concern for the common good. Not about semantics. The capitalism is not a light switch that you turn off or on. This is where people like Professor Richard Wolff are really good. It's not like that. It's not like, oh, anti-capitalism, and that's going to fix everything. We got to get deep and get real and recognize, we have to have a far more sophisticated conversation. But it is true. You see the kinds of things you and I are talking about, and then you look at the way America politically and economically operates today. No, not okay.
And when you talk
every part of your being says not okay.
So, right. And and you see that I'm from Los Angeles and just seeing the way the city's transformed and at every corner, even in the quote unquote nice neighborhoods, there's homelessness beyond I can't even tell you how much it's gone up. I think it hiked up 12% in 1 year, which was a couple years ago at this point. But it just reminds you, like, America is not a safe place. Like it is there, and the amount of first time homelessness especially is going up, and it reminds you that God forbid you get a terminal illness and can't afford your doctor's bills. Like, the reality of being so just unheld is right there in your face. And so
every other
moral center, what does that mean? Like, when we talk about capitalism?
Well, that's to just point at capitalism, I think doesn't totally nail it. It's the way American democracy works today. Having our country, our government being in the grips of the overreach of capital represented by this strain of vulture capitalism. If you just say capitalism, that doesn't give you of itself, like I said, it's not a light switch. So we have developed trickle-down economics, brought into the fore a strain of capitalism in which it is no longer recognized that there are stakeholders besides stockholders. And the canard that was sold to everyone was that if you just make a lot of money, get all the money into the hands of the stockholders, they will get rich, but they'll be job creators, and all that money will trickle down. And so over the last 50 years, there's been a massive transfer of wealth to the tune of $50 trillion into the hands of this 1%. And their business model is not job creation. Too often their business model is job elimination and worker exploitation that came with squeezing everything possible out of the workers, deregulation, tax cuts for the very, very wealthy, and demonization of unions. And what we have is what that is. Everything you're talking about now is the spawn of that. This neglect of the public sector in favor of a small group who represent private power. So it's letting government off the hook if you just say it's capitalism. Because if we didn't have Citizens United, you look at Canada. Canada's a capitalist society, but their corporations have no political power. So that's why your hybrid economies, where you also have socialized medicine, for instance. You were talking about medicine before. We have 1 in 4 Americans who live with medical debt. You don't have that in any other advanced democracy. We don't have medical debt because they have universal health care. We have people rationing their insulin here. Over 1 million people rationing their insulin. You don't have that in any other advanced democracy because they have universal health care. You don't have it in any other advanced democracy where they have free tuition-free colleges and tech schools. They don't have college loan debt. And that's why, in my campaign, there is an economic bill of rights. There is universal health care. There is tuition-free college. There is guaranteed living wage. The fact that we have a $7.25 minimum wage. So yes, it's the activity of capitalism, but it's that it is capitalism that is unfettered. It's called vulture capitalism, crony capitalism, whatever you want to call it. But the answer is got to be a lot more sophisticated than just turn it off like a light switch, because this is simply not how the world works. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And also you mentioned the economic bill of rights, which I was actually going to ask about, is how can we sort of establish some sort of moral ground that is standardizes, for whichever players are making the biggest inroads. And so is there anything from that particular economic bill of rights that you want to share, like the highlights of it?
Well, it's the rights that we should have. It has to do everything to do with collective bargaining, the right to housing, the right to a living wage, the right, we should have childcare, we should have paid family leave, we should have universal health care, we should have tuition-free college. Now, the Overton window has moved so far to the right that what I'm saying, oh, she's so far to the left. No, I'm not. Everything I'm talking about here is considered a moderate position. in every other advanced democracy. The ship has tilted so far to the right that all we're talking about here is, can we just put it upright again so that public policy is helping people thrive? Because at the battlefield at Gettysburg, Lincoln himself said that everybody who died for the Union had given what he called the last full measure of devotion, so the government of the people and by the people and for the people would not perish from the earth. It's perishing now. We've become a government of the corporations, by the corporations, for the corporations. We're not a functioning democracy, we're a functioning oligarchy. And the pillars of that injustice are now baked into the cake. The status quo will not disrupt itself. It's time for the people to step in. Vote for me. You know, one thing you can do.
Thank you.
Because it won't change unless the people intervene. It's like with a drug addict or an alcoholic. When it gets to the point that you realize there has to be an intervention. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. And another thing that you mentioned, and I know we're coming up to an hour, so I want to be respectful of your time, but you know, what it appears to me is that we're so used, you said what your policies are really actually rather moderate, you know, if taken out of
in every other advanced democracy. Here, they're considered very left, but
so my question is, do you see America ever going outside the political binary of just left and right and being able to actually have legitimate third and fourth parties that, you know, and again, maybe it would take like completely upending our whole governmental system based on the way that it's currently structured. But it does feel like politics are imploding in the binary.
Well, but the binary isn't all bad. I mean, you're not a totalitarian state. We don't want everybody to have to see things the same way. There are high-minded conservative principles and there are high-minded liberal principles. The problem is both major political parties have been taken over by the corporatists. So it's almost like it's not. But when it works right, it's binary, but in a positive way. It's the yin and the yang. Nobody has a monopoly on truth in America. So that's number one. We don't want to get to a point where everybody thinks the same about everything. We learn from each other. The other issue brought up, though, is a question that everybody has. Why didn't the founders set up a parliamentary system? Because it is true, if they had set up a parliamentary system, there would be more opportunity to have more voices in the mix. They didn't. That's not going to be changing anytime soon. We've got enough things we're upending. At this point, if people just rise up enough to use the voices that we have and take that rambunctiousness into the ballot box and actually vote for someone, particularly in a primary, who represents your views rather than going along with this groupthink of codependent relationship. We have to go for him because the fascists are at the door, when the whole point is that the fascists are at the door, so you better offer people more. Because Franklin Roosevelt said we would not have a fascist takeover in this country as long as democracy delivered on its promises. So even within the system that we have, even within, you can't transform anything without first accepting it as it is. So instead of jumping to, if only the system were different, we have to transform the system from within. And if enough of us rise up and vote our conscience and vote for what we really want, that's how to exercise the levers of power. That's how to not only endure the crises of this moment, but transform them. And it's possible. It's just a question of whether or not we'll do it. But you know, it's like I said before, we answered slavery with abolition. We answered suppression of women with women's suffrage movement. We've had so many social justice movements in our past, and it's simply our turn, and we can do it too.
Mm-hmm. So, you know, seeing that we're on the Be Here Now network, you know, I've always, you know, I grew up with Ram Dass as sort of family friend and household name. And we kind of touched on this throughout the interview, but I kind of also want to end on it. It's just, you know, it's really not, you know, I've always asked myself, like, is it enough to be here now? Like, what does it actually mean? Like, okay, I'm meditating and I am doing my part, right? And we established this whole conversation, like, that's not enough, right? And so the way I've come to understand it is being here now means like, okay, like we did that meditation part and now we're like fully awake And we are totally here and totally present, including to the things that we don't want to see. And the idea would be, God willing, that because we're seeing things we don't want to see, because now we're present to them, we're motivated to fix them. That's the whole philosophy that I have. But how does that, I guess my question is, how does that land for you? Or what does Be Here Now and the legacy of Ram Dass mean for you personally?
I knew Ram Dass.
Mm-hmm.
And in 1990, the end of 1994, I called him. And I said that I had been invited to the White House. And he bit my head off. I had been asked by the Clintons if, I don't want to go too far into all that, but I had an opportunity to put together a group. And I called Ram Dass, and he bit my head off. Wow, they're like, no, you don't want to, don't have anything to do with them. Years later, I was in Hawaii, and he had had a stroke. And he was the sweetest, most wonderful, most open-hearted person. He was a completely different man. So I know from my experience, and you, I'm sure, do too, that he in his own life got to the point where he got that be here now meant be love now. Just in any moment. If you just I'm only here to represent love. I'm only here to be love as best I can. You're going to see things you wouldn't have seen. You're going to hear things you wouldn't have heard. You're going to affect things you wouldn't have affected. You're going to have an influence you wouldn't have known. That's what it means. And that's what I feel even that man at the Iowa State Fair who was working for Trump, by the time at the end, we talked for maybe 5-7 minutes. And I didn't mention who I was or anything till the end. And then by the end, oh, well, that's so great, blah, blah, blah. And the woman yesterday on the plane, we never got around. She didn't know I was running for president or anything like that. But at the end, when she asked my opinion, I said, well, I'm a Democrat, and we talked. She had gotten enough benevolence from me that there was no. So if you are a nicer person, you're going to influence a situation you might not even know. You just try to open your heart. Sometimes I want to be the one, at the end of the assembly line. I remember saying to a friend of mine many years ago about a boyfriend I was having a problem with, he just needs to get it, the most codependent thing you could possibly say. And she said, oh, he'll get it, Marianne, but not today and not from you. When we stop trying to be right with everybody and instead just be open and just try to be kinder and more generous, certain conversations might come up, they might not come up, but we've still added to the basic trajectory of healing and improvement. And I think Ram Dass would agree with that.
Thank you.
I was so scared of him when I was younger. And then he was just, what a blessing and such sweetness.
I love getting everyone's kind of Ram Dass anecdotes, just especially the personal ones it shows so much of his personality. So anything else that you want to add, talk about, share? Obviously, let us know how to follow you and your campaign.
Oh, thank you. Sure, that, Marianne2024.com. And I hope people will look at my website. And if you think that this campaign matters, even $1 thrown in direction of the campaign would be greatly appreciated. Sign up to volunteer. We need to move from an economic model that now dominates everything back to a humanitarian and democratic model. And I think probably everyone listening knows it's literally killing us if we don't. People with lack of health care, people rationing their insulin, the toxins in our water, carcinogens in our food, unanswered climate crisis, lack of gun safety laws, foreign policy, too often dominated by military-industrial complex. If we do not step in, it will continue in the direction it's moving. We're moving right towards the iceberg. The Republicans are going straight for it. The corporatist Democrats are going more slowly and will hit it at a different angle. We got to turn the ship around. And I hope people will look at my campaign and consider whether or not in their heart they feel that support for my campaign is a way to help turn the ship around.
Thank you so much. And
Thank
it's
you.
really so inspiring to talk to you. If you didn't get from my questions, I'm not, my entry point into politics or caring or understanding them is not from the politics, but from, the mental health and spiritual components and trauma components of how politics are really.
Well, poverty is traumatizing.
Exactly.
Poverty, debt is crippling. You can't separate today. Other people say they bring you the data. And I said to somebody at a meeting not long ago, I'm not interested in data. I'm interested in despair. When you say 70% of Americans, because of our current structure, live with constant economic stress, anxiety, and then they wonder where the mental health crisis comes from. A lot of it is an economic justice problem. So I'm glad to have had this conversation with you because I think more of us, including you and I, are ready to understand how those two interrelate and must be addressed within the space of their interrelation, or we never get to a real answer.
Agreed. All right. Well, everyone, thank you for listening. Marianne, thank you for coming on.
Thank you. And I think I said Marianne2024.com, right?
Yes,
Marianne2024.com.
Look her up. Really incredible speaker, author, politician, and human being. I think really representing that human part of the political self is really what the heart of this is. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Madison. Thank you.